Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Pedagogy Non Grata podcast. I'm really excited to have both Dr. Jeffrey Bowers and Dr. Devin Kearns here today. We're going to be discussing systematic phonics. And I'm genuinely really excited about this podcast. I've been talking to my wife about it for weeks as we plan this. Um, and I'm excited actually to hear from both of you. I think you're both very impressive researchers in your own right. You've both got dozens of peer-reviewed studies, and I know that Devin Kearns has won several awards for some of his research. Um, Dr. Bowers, I apologize if you also won awards. I just didn't see it in your bio. Um, and I think, Dr. Kearns has been definitely popular in his research within that science and reading movement space. I know the IDA has promoted a lot of his research, and truthfully, I've cited his research many times in both books that I've already published and that are upcoming. And Dr. Bowers, I think you're a little bit of a misunderstood character, truthfully. And I hope that we get to touch on that a little bit today in our conversation. Um, I think you have written the most legitimate criticism of systematic phonics to date from a research perspective. And I say that from the perspective of being someone who's generally very in favor of systematic phonics, who as a teacher uses systematic phonics and has written in favor of systematic phonics. But I'm aware of only one other credible paper that makes any sort of criticism of systematic phonics, and that is Camilli 2003, which you cite multiple times in your paper as well. So we're gonna talk about that. But the reason why I say you're sort of misunderstood is I think people have then taken that to mean that you're in favor of whole language. In fact, the number one paper I see cited by people advocating for whole language is your paper. So I'm going to let you each introduce yourself, and then we'll actually start on the topic of whole language, and then we'll get into some definitions of difference between systematic phonics and whole language, and then we'll allow Dr. Bowers and Dr. Kearns to sort of discuss his criticisms of the research on systematic phonics. Now, you once came on my podcast once before to have a debate on this topic, and I don't think that's our goal today. I think the problem with debating is it sometimes entrenches our viewpoints, both as listeners and as people participating. Well, what I'd really like to do, and what I've like to try to do with the Roundtable podcast for anyone who's seen those, is try and see where is their consensus, where do you agree with each other, um, because I think there's value from the teacher perspective in seeing where is their agreement between two researchers with very different perspectives. Um, so before we go any further, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves in case I've made any mistakes there. So Dr. Bowers, will let you go first, and then Dr. Burns.
Yeah, first, thanks for organizing this. I do appreciate the opportunity to clarify things because I do think I'm misrepresented and misunderstood. So it would be great to have the opportunity to clarify some things. I'm a bit of an outsider, so most of my work is not in reading instruction. I'm a cognitive psychologist interested in completely different things for the most part, and artificial intelligence and brains and things like this. But my background, I did a lot of work on adult single word perception, and it turns out my brother, that I know Nathan knows, of Peter Bowers, is quite active in an alternative approach called structured word inquiry, and he got me intrigued by a lot of his arguments, and that's how I kind of got invested and interested in this world, and I became, at some level, even more interested. I'm certainly very interested in the topic. I'm also struck by maybe the sociology of the field. I mean, how I felt of how my findings are, or my claims have been really hard for people to digest, to appreciate and respond to, I think, in ways that I would have expected. So I've become also interested just in the sociology of this field as well. But fundamentally, this is a very important issue, and I'm interested in the topic of what does the evidence say.
So
So
I just before I move on to Dr. Kearns, I do want to say that well, I don't agree with all of your conclusions. Although as a teacher and not a researcher, I feel a little um, smug for even making such a claim. But um, I think the criticisms you provide are, at least some of them are fair, and I think you provide a legitimate overview of weaknesses in the research that researchers on this topic need to address moving forward. So I actually encourage anybody to read your paper criticizing systematic phonics, even though I'm actually a pretty strong advocate of systematic phonics myself. Dr. Kearns, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Well, first, don't forget to call me Devin, but I'm sure Jeff feels the same way too. But yeah, so my research has been on early literacy and adolescent literacy. And in the early literacy space, I've done a lot of projects where we've designed and implemented reading interventions and reading instruction for students, particularly students with an at-risk for serious reading difficulty, often students who would be classified as having dyslexia. And so my work in that space has been to implement word recognition instruction of a phonics type and to examine the effects of that work. I've done a couple of meta-analyses. I've a couple of doctoral students who've done meta-analyses recently on some cool topics. One of them about decodable text, actually, and leveled books and the effects of those on student outcomes. And so I'm just generally interested in how do we best help elementary age kids learn to read and kids with reading difficulty learn to read. And my experience comes from a different lens. I was a teacher for 7 years, so and teacher who came to do this work by virtue of having had challenges as a teacher getting kids to succeed and realizing I was missing something. And for me, what I felt was the thing that was missing was systematic, explicit instruction on foundational skills.
Great. So before we go any further in this discussion, I'd really like to just get some definitions of terms, because I think, people are listening to this podcast and us participating in, we're probably most of us pretty familiar, but I think the average teacher might not even really be even aware that there's a huge debate on this topic, let alone what do the specific points mean. So if Dr. Kearns, you could just start us off by explaining what is the difference between whole language or balanced literacy and a systematic phonics approach.
Wow,
Easy question to start.
Yeah, easy question, I was going to say. So I'd be curious to hear Jeff's point as well. So these three things get contrasted, particularly in terms of word recognition, right? And so when I say word recognition, I mean the ability to identify the meaning of a word based on the orthographic input that you have. You can also recognize a word based on the sounds, but for our purposes, word recognition is going to refer to that. And so when we talk about those three categories, we're typically talking about how do students read words. So in terms of that alone, I'm going to just focus on that because there are other pieces to the puzzle, particularly when people argue about the value of whole language. One of the important contributions people think it has is that it had an emphasis on meaning that was pervasive across the curriculum. And as a result, there's some potential benefit in that piece of it. But I'm going to focus just on the word recognition piece for now. So in a whole language approach, the way that word recognition generally occurs is by identifying the word based on as little information from the letters as possible. And that idea came from Ken Goodman. He wrote this paper, very famous paper in 1967, the psycholinguistic guessing game. I forget the beginning of it. That's the basic term was psycholinguistic guessing game. And what he said in that paper was that readers are searching for meaning in words. And so what they're trying to do is to get the answer with as little orthographic, when I say orthographic, I mean spelling input as possible. So they're going to look at the letters, but as soon as the letters trigger the right answer based on meaning, they're going to move on. They're not going to try to access the word in any other way. And so what that means is for instruction that you don't teach children to decode, you don't teach them the connection between the letters and sounds. Things that are thought to be successful are things like contextual guessing. So thinking about what is the context in which I've read the word, what word do I predict is this word? And then also, if we think about other pieces of it, it might be something like the sort of, I always call it lips the fish strategy. So where you sort of tell your students, get your mouth ready. which means basically that the students are supposed to sort of, like, they say the first sound and then they figure out the rest of it, get your mouth right. I don't really understand it, but it gets taught. So anyway, so those are kind of the primary strategies in addition to looking at pictures, because again, that's a meaning cue to the right answer. And so those things are what whole language is. I'll try to be briefer about balanced literacy and Lily. Balanced literacy is, well, let's talk about phonics first. So when people talk about phonics, people are talking about phonics is a way of teaching, right? Phonics is a way of providing students with word recognition instruction. And the focus of phonics instruction is to link letters and sounds in some very clear way. A says a, B says b, and then having students read words using that information in a variety. There are many different ways you could do that, but basically phonics means identifying some kind of letter sound correspondence, and using that information to identify word, right? Balanced literacy is supposed to be kind of a middle ground in a way. And I think that one of the things that characterizes balanced literacy is balanced literacy advocates in terms of word recognition say, we're in favor of teaching about letter sounds. We don't think there should be as much of an emphasis on letter sounds as people in the kind of phonics world would want, although what that means is sort of ill-defined. And so that's one of the challenges of whole balanced literacy is like, well, what does that mean to have some but not a lot, right? And so, but it's much closer to whole language in the sense that there is an emphasis on kind of using other sources of information, often using strategies to read words, like, if I don't know how to do it this way, I do it another way. And that's sort of challenging in terms of working memory. But that's, I think, what balanced literacy is. Although Jeff knows at least as much as I do, and probably more about these terms. So feel free to correct Jeff and expand.
Well, no, I mean, I think I largely agree. I mean, I would, in all cases, I take, both whole language and balanced literature and phonics as forms of instruction. So I don't think of it, maybe the original classic paper by Goodman had a theory of how word recognition took place. I don't, honestly, I've never even read the original paper. I mean, some of the theories, behind balanced literacy or whole language don't interest me, and I think they are silly in some ways, as if it's as natural as could be. But I'm more interested in the practice of treating it as a form of instruction, and I grant you that balanced literacy and whole language are much more fuzzy concepts than what structured than systematic phonics would be. And just to be upfront, I think I'm not an advocate, although I'm critical of phonics. I'm critical of phonics because there seems to be so much scientific consensus in support of it. I'm equally, or probably even less impressed by whole language, because the theoretical motivation of whole language and balanced literacy makes very little sense to me. So so if people are citing me as evidence for their whole language data, I mean, you're citing the wrong person, because I'm not an advocate of whole language.
I can't count the number of times a whole language person has cited you to me, to be honest. But
I mean, I think it'd be fair enough, I think, for them to cite me as highlighting that the evidence for phonics isn't as strong as claimed. I think that's fair enough. Don't cite me as an advocate of saying that I've provided evidence for whole language, because I certainly haven't found any evidence for whole language. So, if you want to cite me, go ahead and cite me, but cite me in the right way. I'm certainly not claiming. And I haven't looked in detail about, these differences of whole language and balanced literacy, partly because I'm not that interested in them, because they don't hit me as very promising. But I agree with the description we just had from them.
okay. Well, then let's dive a little deeper into that, because I think one area of consensus between you and largely, I would think, most of the serious research community is that there is a problem with whole language instruction, or a balanced literacy as some type of whole language instruction. So what is the issue with whole language? And I'll let Dr. Bauer start, and I'll let Dr. Kearns add to it, or Jeff and Devin, sorry, as you've requested.
Well, I mean, I mean, I don't know if we may not have, I mean, I'm not I don't think there's much evidence for, we should, I'd be hard pressed to find evidence to support whole language. But on the other hand, I don't know if there's good evidence that phonics is more effective than whole language. I mean, it's not a particularly sophisticated theoretical model of how language works, but it may capture to extent or balance. If you throw in a little bit of phonics or a little bit of grapheme phoneme correspondences, you throw a little bit of meaning. You focus on engagement and practice. All those kinds of practices may add up to be as effective as phonics in terms of the empirical evidence for them, anyways. So I'm not an I mean, I'm kind of really that in truth, I'm trying to say we might need to find a third way. And this reading war is a battle between these two approaches, and people are so fixated on this dichotomy that they're blind to the fact that maybe different approaches altogether. And I've suggested another one. We're not going to go into this. We might, but I don't expect to talk much about it. And I don't think there's much evidence for my approach either. So I'm not advocating that there's a lot of evidence for some other approach. But people are so fixated on this divide between these two things that they're just unable to open their mind to the fact that maybe neither is such effective approaches. So I don't know if we have a consensus that there are problems with whole language instruction any more than in my case, I would say there's no evidence empirically that it's the outcomes are worse than in phonics.
Dr. Kearns, I'll let you respond to that.
So a lot of the meta-analyses have focused on comparing phonics with often some unknown control or sort of, it could be a lot of things, basically, right? It's basically not systematic. And what that means is that it's not all whole language necessarily, right? It's just some random stuff that's occurring that's often not specified. And so, it's sometimes harder to pull apart the kind of the whole language piece specifically, because there aren't as many studies where people are talking about whole language specifically, right? And I think that's one of the challenges is, what is whole language versus what is phonics? And it's kind of sometimes ill-defined. And the result is that people sort of feel like, well, yes, phonics is better than something random, unspecified, but that doesn't mean it's better than whole language specifically. And so, so what do I think about that? So I think that first, some random thing, right? This sort of alternative, I think often is, I think the default has been, at least in the US, so I don't want to speak for Canada or the UK or Australia or any other, other languages that use English as a system. I don't think in a lot of these places, or in the US at least, basically people have focused on either phonics or just doing something that looks like whole language, right? Which basically means that having kids look at pictures, having kids identify words from context, in part because that was kind of the, the of or whatever of the time, that was what you did, right? And so as a result, I think that's sometimes what something else is. But, Jeff makes the point, I don't want to misrepresent it, but they're like, that isn't clear that it's some random, what that other thing is. And so it's then hard to say what the effect is versus a particular kind of instruction. I would say, however, if you look across all the studies, the evidence is pretty good for phonics versus something random, or whatever that is, or some other kind of counterfactual. So, and the effect sizes range, and they're not as compelling when you look at it longitudinally. It's, the effects aren't as strong when you look at meaning. And so all of those things are reasons to sort of think, what is the real benefit of phonics, right? Where is that going to get you? And I think that, empirically in the meta-analytic data and in some studies, there do seem to be immediate effects on both word recognition and on comprehension, and some of those things persist, right? And it's particularly true in word recognition, but there are long-term effects for reading comprehension as well. So I think that my point of view is that there are no doubt lots of concerns we can have about the value of phonics instruction versus something else specific. But I think that if you take all of the studies in aggregate, it's pretty clear to me, at least, is what Jeff I think wants to kind of think about is, that this approach, this sort of generally systematic way of thinking about there's a scope and sequence, there's explicit systematic instruction on, what letters say what sound. I think, that approach seems to have better evidence overall than something else, whereas whole language has no evidence of being better than something random, right? So to me, I would argue that phonics is better than whole language in the sense that, like, there's at least evidence that phonics beats something random. There's not evidence the whole language beats something random. So I don't, that's kind of been my thought about it. But, Jeff, that's kind of, I think, the important piece here, right? And this is what I'm curious to hear your thoughts about.
If I could just give a follow-up question there to Jeff, and in part because I feel like we're kind of getting towards our next topic before we finish talking about this topic. One thing I have noticed in your papers, Jeff, is that you seem pretty clear that you think that you would agree with those systematic phonics scholars in that so far as students need some form of instruction on grapheme phoneme correspondences. Now, my understanding is that theoretically where you disagree is what that instruction looks like, and that you think that the morphology and etymology of it needs to be brought more into the picture, and it needs to be done less in isolation as typically done in phonics. And I haven't seen you write about the topic of, the cueing methods or telling kids to look at pictures when they don't know a word. But I would guess from what I know of your writing that that's probably not a strategy you would endorse. So I'm just curious if those theoretical elements are things you would agree with, or if I've misread you.
No, I think that's roughly right. I mean, yeah, so definitely kids need to learn the grapheme phoneme correspondences. That's for sure. Question is how to do that. And it's, whole language also teaches grapheme phoneme correspondences. They do it in a more unorganized, unsystematic way. But at the end of the day, a child needs to be able to read aloud, So, so whether it would have been, the best approach is to do it unsystematically in a meaningful context, or maybe it would have been better to do it as systematic in a meaningful context. I don't know, but on the balance, the question is, yes, you need to learn grapheme phoneme correspondences, how to do it best. There's structured word inquiry suggests one thing, excuse me. Balanced literacy suggests another way, and systematic phonics suggests yet another way. So there's 3 different ways that you could teach, and there are probably others maybe, but there are 3 different ways that you might go about teaching grapheme phonics correspondences. And it's an empirical question, which is best. I mean, you could have theoretical motive, you could, you can make stories about why each one of those could be best, and they might all, I think I can make a plausible scenario case for different approaches. I think some are more persuasive than others theoretically, but at the end of the day, I'm interested in the empirical evidence for these claims. You got to remember, I think the important thing to emphasize is that people are claiming that the empirical evidence is sufficiently powerful and strong that we need to change the curriculums of schools. And they literally, since 2007, changed what would have been, I guess, balanced literacy in the UK or in England. And by law, for almost 20 years now, on the basis of scientific evidence, we have now synthetic systematic phonics in England. And there are arguments to change the laws in various states to require systematic phonics in the States and in various states in Australia. So there's a claim that the evidence is sufficiently strong to change curriculum. And I think it's fair to ask, how powerful is that evidence? And I partly agree and partly disagree with what Devin just said about the evidence. I don't know if you want me to talk about that now or not, but I do agree that this issue of comparing it to randomness is an important point that I want to talk a
Yeah,
bit more
and
about.
I definitely want to give you time to respond to that. I just want to make sure that we fully explored this topic before we move to the next, if it's okay with both of you. So I'm gonna give this question over to Kearns, and I will say, Dr. Bowers, I I generally have sympathy for your perspective here, and that you're saying you're trying to be an empiricist, and you're not worried about what the theoretical part is, and I tend to be the same. However, I think it is important to understand the backdrop of this discussion. So, Devin, if you could share what your thoughts are about the possible problems with a whole language approach in a classroom, and then we'll start getting into whether or not there's weaknesses that need to be addressed on the phonics research side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure, Jeff, that people would teach kids specific grapheme phoneme correspondences all the time in this approach. Or if they did, you sort of described it as sort of varied, I think, but like, it's kind of haphazard is really what it ends up being, right? There's no sort of order to it. I remember in my initial teacher training, they said, well, if you're reading a book about, cats, then teach the C says, k, right? And then you could do something totally different the next week. So I think that's a fact about whole languages. I don't think people are always teaching kids a lot about the grapheme phoneme correspondence system or anything about that. And so, and they're also putting a heavy emphasis on these other strategies, like using contextual guessing, using pictures, and doing the kind of, the lips, this lips the fish, like get your mouth ready strategy. They're putting a lot of stock into that, a lot of emphasis on that. And I think that's a pretty serious problem. So I mean, I think it's important for me to say clearly, like, I think to me, the evidence is really strong. I feel like it'd be remiss if I didn't say it. The evidence is really strong that phonics is better than approaches that are not systematic, which often include whole language, but are not always. And that the evidence is strong enough to me to suggest that some kind of expectations that children learn about that in a systematic way are appropriate. I do think that a lot of places may have gone a little too far based on a misunderstanding of the evidence and a misunderstanding of what is meant by good phonics instruction, because what people are doing is often beyond that. But I think it's important I want to be really clear. I think that explicit systematic phonics instruction is better than whole language because it shares so many characteristics with these unclear approaches. And because when you compare phonics to many of these, it almost always, turns out to have, significant effects on some measure, right? Some of them are on, measures we are not as excited about, like, non-word reading or just word recognition. It doesn't extend always to reading comprehension. I think that's a legitimate concern, but the fact that we're getting positive effects on some of these other measures, I think is important. And I think it shows us that it's something worth pushing teachers to emphasize. How much you push that and how you do it exactly, I have some thoughts about, but I do think I'm okay with that, with setting some reasonable policy, creating some expectations. I think even in the paper, Jeff, I think the conclusion is you have concerns about all the papers, but overall the effects are positive. I mean, like, you can sort of like say the effects are not as positive, the effects are limited in some ways, but I think overall the effects are not negative, at least, and I think in some cases definitely positive. And I think, to me, that's the reason I feel like it's okay to do something with phonics. I'll stop there because I'm starting to say the same thing again and again, but yeah.
Really helpful. I'm gonna anecdotally just support one thing you said, Devin, and then I'm gonna let Jeffrey start giving his formal criticism of the phonics research, which I think is important for people to hear, actually. And I just want to say anecdotally, this is just my personal experience. When I was in teachers college, I did not hear the words phonics. I did not hear the words phonemic awareness. I didn't hear the word morphology. In fact, I graduated from teachers college not knowing what fluency, morphology, or phonemic awareness were. And I was certainly never encouraged to teach phonics. So I think it wasn't just that my university was for a whole language. They just didn't believe at that period of time. They didn't believe in a skill-based form of instruction to reading on any front. But I was definitely strongly encouraged to teach 3Q. Now, that's not to say that that's the experience of every teacher in North America, but there definitely was, I think, some cultural element there where teachers were in a large part being encouraged towards a very holistic whole language approach. Um, and I've heard a lot of teachers say the same thing to me, that they've had similar experiences. Jeff, let's get straight into it now. So I've agreed that you share some reasonable limitations in the research. You would definitely go further as to characterize it as more than reasonable limitations. Let's hear, what do you see as the weaknesses in the research in phonics, and where do we need more research?
Yeah, sure, good. I mean, so the first thing, picking up a bit on Devin's point before, is that, it's striking, given that people are trying to change curriculum, and the reading wars is the focus of so much interest, that there are almost no studies that compare systematic phonics to whole language or balanced literacy. I mean, it's just a weird fact that there's very few studies that actually compare those two forms of instruction in a systematic way in an experiment. These meta-analyses that people use to argue for systematic phonics, from and declare that the reading wars are over and things based on all these meta-analyses. The meta-analyses literally do not compare systematic phonics to the condition that they're making conclusions about. They have a mix, and some of those times the mix is actually literally nothing. It's a waiting list control condition. So I mean, it's not even a mess. It's nothing. Is mixed in sometimes. You have and certainly phonics is better than nothing. But maybe structured maybe whole language would be better than nothing as well. So it's not a trivial point to be, if you're going to make a claim that one thing is better than another, then it's absurd after 50 years and 25 years since the National Reading Panel that there's not a single meta-analysis or very many systematic studies that have compared these two conditions and then decide on that basis, what does the scientific evidence. But let's put that aside for the moment, because this is where I think I slightly disagree with the strength of the evidence here. Let's put that whole thing aside. Let's assume that actually, and this is a big, shouldn't do this, but let's assume that this meta-analyses were comparing, all the data, that the results that are obtained are the control condition is some mixture of balanced literacy and whole language, or whatever, call it balanced literacy, the strongest case. So let's say everything was balanced literacy versus whole language, and all these meta-analyses, a dozen of them or so over the last 25 years, those are the comparisons. It's almost always the case that there's very little evidence for benefits other than in decoding. So there's over and over again, you'll get good evidence for, you can name regular words and irregular words more accuracy. That's true. That's also true in England, where they have this phonics screening check, that since the implementation of systematic phonics in England in 2007, they actually systematically monitor children on this test, and those scores have gone up. So decoding skills do improve. That's what you're training. That's what phonics does. Is you're training kids to decode, and there is good evidence that phonics is effective in improving decoding. But if you wanted to show me good evidence for long-lasting effects on reading comprehension, reading accuracy, reading text, I don't think there's a single meta-analysis that will show any of those effects. So there just isn't evidence for long-term effects on a meta-analysis on reading comprehension. I'm sure you'll be able to find a study or two that will, but if you synthesize the literature, there's no evidence. That's not to say it won't. I think an important confusion sometimes when I say there's no evidence, it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means there's no evidence. It might work, but the relevant studies. I mean, and I appreciate these studies are difficult to carry out. the measures are noisy. It may well work, and we would still not get evidence for it to some extent. So I'm not claiming it doesn't work. I'm saying no one should claim the empirical evidence supports the conclusion that systematic phonics or any form of phonics is improving the long-term reading comprehension skills of children. Now, and given that the meta-analyses are not designed appropriately to test this reading war debate between whole language and systematic phonics, it seems to me the best evidence we have out there is the naturalistic experiment that's been carried out in England. So for almost 20 years now, England has required systematic phonics in all state schools. And since 2000, and I wrote this down, 2012, I think it is. So over a decade, there's this phonics screening check that every single child is assessed in their capacity to name a set of regular words and irregular words, or regular words and regular pseudo words, and you measure their accuracy on this test. And people have highlighted the success of systematic phonics in England based on the fact, one thing they highlight is, indeed, performance has gone up on this phonics screening check. And I agree with that, it has gone up. But the way they measure it gives the impression it's gone up more than it has, but no doubt in models, children are better at reading non-words and regular words than they were, according to this test, over the last decade now. So again, if you teach kids to decode, they get better at decoding. The question, though, is, okay, how has England done on all these international tests that are thought to measure reading outcomes? So, for instance, in the most recent PISA test, which is an international test, what does it stand for? It's like the Program for International Study Assessment, PISA. It's a standard test carried out every few years. And England, of all the English-speaking countries, came last in the most recent PISA. Now, these numbers are all kind of similar, so I wouldn't want to make any statistical claim, but if you go through because Singapore has an assessment in English, so Singapore, Ireland, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia all got better scores on reading than England did after almost 2 decades of systematic phonics. Similarly, there's something called PEARLS, a Progress in International Reading and Literacy Studies, PEARLS. And people often cite the results in PEARLS as evidence that, reading outcomes have improved in England as a product of introduction of phonics. But it's just a mischaracterization of the data. I mean, these numbers won't mean too much other than the main point. I'll just give you the raw scores over the years, but the point is, you'll notice they haven't changed very much. The number doesn't matter much, but in 2001, it was 553. There was a dip for 1 year, 539, and then it was 552, 559, 558. I mean, the numbers are effectively flat since 2001 on this test. And people have tried to construe and claim that these data support the evidence that, implementing a curriculum in England has improved reading outcomes, but neither PISA nor PEARLS. Now, there's something else called the SAT, Standardized Assessment Tests in England. So kids have various standardized tests in English and in various things, in math, science, and reading, and so forth. And the numbers have gone up, and people highlight, success. But the numbers have gone up across, it's kind of like grade inflation, or kids are getting smarter, or something like that. But there is no clear trend that, the implementation of phonics has selectively improved reading outcomes. It's just sort of like a slow increase. If you ignore the fact that everything else is going up, it looks good, but it's not really a very persuasive test that the introduction of phonics has selectively led to an improvement in outcomes. So, it's just the meta-analyses don't provide much evidence. The studies haven't been carried out to test the hypothesis that would be relevant to implementing curriculum change. And the one major experiment, naturalistic experiment that people like Australia and various states want to kind of copy is England. And, England's doing fine. I mean, they rank relatively well on all these tests. But, in this last one, and particularly striking in PISA, they, did worse than New Zealand, which I was always told was like the hotbed of whole language or something like this. I don't quite know if I've said that and people dispute that, so that may not be true. But nevertheless, it's striking that where is the benefits from all this? Yeah, so that's my critique is that, when people say the evidence is very clear, I mean, I totally understand the intuition that given grapheme phoneme correspondences need to be taught, it's good to teach it explicitly. So there's kind of a very straightforward, logical thing that I think is very compelling to people. And actually, I'm in favor of that. I mean, my alternative approach, structured word inquiry, teaches grapheme phoneme correspondences explicitly. So I'm not even, I share that assumption, but I think phonics has taken it so far that it's benefited from my intuition. I don't know why. All I know is that there are not very compelling empirical evidence in support of phonics. Why is that? And my intuition would be, well, maybe phonics has gone so far down one route that it's maybe benefiting on improving the decoding, but it's demotivating students. It's not helping them see it in a semantic context. There's other kind of cues that are helpful that are not being exploited. I don't know, I don't know what it is. I don't know if my preferred approach in the end would fare better on these empirical tests. It's possible that phonics is the best approach, and all these measures are so noisy that it's just hard to get a measure out of it. I mean, I'm willing to concede that maybe Pearls and PISA and SATs are just such noisy measures that we can't make comparisons. But what you shouldn't do for sure is look at those empirical findings. You shouldn't be taking those meta-analyses. You should not be taking Pearls and PISA and SATs as evidence for the effectiveness of phonics, because that I don't think is justified at the moment.
That was a very long, in-depth answer and discussion of some of the weaknesses of the research in phonics. I want to make a quick summary, not for Devin's sake, but for the sake of the listener who's a teacher. I just want to put one quick clarification. Dr. Bowers, you mentioned that Canada did better on PISA scores. I just want to point out that as a Canadian, that there is some evidence that our scores have been sort of doctored, for lack of a better word. There was a paper put out by the IDA. Specifically, we have extremely high attrition rate on our assessments compared internationally. I think England has less than 5% attrition on their studies for PISA, whereas Canada is closer to 20% exclusion rates. So if we're excluding the bottom 20%, it's no wonder we're doing phenomenal on international testing. But I would say that's not exactly valid. But I just want to sort of summarize really quickly, if you will, allow it what you said for the teacher, and you can clarify if I've said anything wrong. So the first thing I think you're talking about was the fact that meta-analyses aren't really specifically looking at studies that are comparing a whole language approach with a phonics approach. They're looking at some phonics studies, some whole language studies, where both are looking at random things as their comparison, and then they're often comparing effect sizes afterwards. Whereas you would say that's not direct enough of an analytic approach. It seems to me you're also arguing that there's limited evidence that phonics improves longitudinal comprehension outcomes. And that you would also argue that these naturalistic experiments, so almost like epidemiological research of, what are the test scores on international levels doing? So specifically England, where they've had a very long courted systematic phonics approach, and that they haven't seen very large changes in their learning outcomes. Is that an accurate summary of your argument?
Yeah.
Devin, if you would like to respond, the floor is yours.
Yeah, like a lot of exciting and rich stuff there. I am not an expert on sort of international research and these kinds of studies. I mean, I just sort of looked a little bit, and I know that one thing that is true is that the SAT was redesigned in 2015. And so, in the graph, Jeff, in the paper, there's this kind of like massive decline, which is really about the fact that the test was kind of redesigned. And I don't know enough about that, but I think it was the reading and writing component that was the one that they really emphasized. So I think it's, you know, to that point, a little harder for me to sort of interpret that as evidence that, you know, this isn't working. And, you know, I don't pretend to understand all of the, you know, pearls and PISA data, but I'm not convinced that they show this with the kind of clarity that Jeff is talking about, especially looking at those SAT scores. You know, I mean, if you look at them over time, it's hard to know after 2015 what's happening, but there is an increase. Whether it's statistically significant, I have no idea. But you know, you can see on the scores there is an increase over time. So whether or not, if you compared, say, you know, 2006 to 2015, whether or not you get a significant, I don't know. But I'm a little more sanguine about the possibility than Jeff is. But again, I do not consider myself an expert on international research, and so I shouldn't say really too much more about that. I think the other thing I would say is that Jeff talked about structured word inquiry, which is an approach that involves, I don't want to misrepresent it, but like a lot of emphasis on morphology. There's also an emphasis kind of on inquiry and using kind of inquiry methods to kind of puzzle out a little bit, you know, the sort of meanings of words using morphological units. And they have these kind of cool grids that they use to help students do that kind of puzzling out. And I think that, you know, in general, the idea is a good one. There are a couple of things about it that I should highlight. One is that, you know, the data on structured word inquiry that approach specifically aren't yet compelling. That doesn't mean they won't be, as Jeff points out, but you know, there needs to be a lot more work there to make clear that that's really going to make a huge difference. But there is definitely evidence that approaches to instruction involve morphology, focusing on meaning units, those do have very good evidence. And so particularly for adolescents, there's a lot of evidence that, and it's true of the elementary grades too, it increases in value over time, that students benefit from focusing on the meaning units in words. So there's no question about that as well. I think that, so structured word inquiry needs more research. Morphology teaching in general, I think it has a strong evidence base. Jeff kind of alluded to, you know, kind of the like, you know, sort of the method of instruction, and this is true of structured word inquiry, but also kind of whole language approach, is it's sort of an inquiry focused model typically. And there's a lot more focus on puzzling, you know, I said puzzling things out, figuring things out for yourself in a way, rather than providing students with kind of that direct, explicit instruction, right? And I think to me, that's one thing that beyond the content of instruction characterizes good phonics instruction is the explicitness of the teaching, the clarity with which students are introduced to letter sound correspondences. So A says ah, well, let's read some words with ah. And I think that point is really important, that it's not simply in, you know, systematic explicit phonics instruction. Part of that explicit piece is critical, because that's where I think a lot of the power is when you teach students directly some of these things and you give them massive amounts of practice with those things, that has really big effects on student achievement. And so even though it's not specific to phonics, that I think it makes a tremendous difference. But do you want me to pause there? Okay, all right. So I think you know, and so Jeff talked too about motivation. I think there are some data on motivation suggesting that success improves motivation, right? Rather than kind of the other way around. And so, you know, one of the things that phonics does for kids is, at least in the area of word recognition, build some confidence. And that's one of the things that people talk about with, you know, kids with, you know, dyslexia, reading difficulty, that one of the things they get out of phonics, you know, kind of teaching, is they get some confidence, and that can kind of bootstrap, you know, motivation. So I think, to me, in some ways, the motivation piece is there for good phonics instruction on kind of the other side. The trick in between is that phonics can feel laborious, but I think that's where, as a, you know, a former teacher, like I have had the experience, I know that's true for many folks, that like if you do it right, if you do it well, phonics instruction does not have to be boring. It does not have to be, difficult. It does not have to be just, drill. Although I don't even mind the word drill. I mean, repetition of key ideas is not a bad thing. So giving kids opportunities to repeat things, not just rote instruction, but applying them. We teach you about letter sounds. A says ah. Here's some words where A says ah. Let's read those words. So I think, that's another piece of this that we shouldn't lose, is the explicit piece, in addition to just the kind of the teaching of sound symbols or graphing phonemes.
Let me respond 2 points to that. One, in terms of, I mean, maybe the term structured word inquiry is a bit unfortunate. I think it's fine, but people mistake inquiry as if there's not explicit instruction. I mean, I think there's plenty of explicit instruction. I mean, another term would, I mean, I think Peter sometimes says he wish he used the term structured word investigations or something like this, where you can kind of systematically study the logic of the organization of these things. And and a lot of it is explicitly taught, but also you can ask kids, okay, what other affix could you add? And let's add affixes. But there's lots of explicit instruction going on, both at the level of grapheme phoneme correspondences and in the and the building of a morphological matrix or morphological family, where you're teaching a whole vocabulary of related words. It's a nice way to structure and teach vocabulary, teach meaning, teach the regularities that occur amongst lots of words, teach grapheme phoneme correspondences within this kind of family. So I think people overemphasize. There is some inquiry and some discovery of these things that can happen, but it's in the context. The other structured word inquiry. The structured is sort of like, this is not a random hippie kind of let's just discover things. It's a very scientific approach to trying teaching the linguistic system of the writing system in a linguistically sophisticated manner. So it's very structured. So, but with regard to this motivation thing and the drilling of teaching, I mean, I think one thing I would like as an example of why something like structured word inquiry, I don't know how much we want to go into this alternative, it's outside the phonics realm exactly, but most kids will learn to read under systematic phonics. Most kids will learn, using, most people are literate, despite the fact in England before we introduced systematic phonics. So most people will learn and learn to do well, but there's some kids won't. And those are the kids we're really worried about most often. And kids that are dyslexic or just slow readers are children that typically have phonological deficits to some extent. There'll be phonological processing problems. So this is just this is not scientific at this point. This is my in trying to share an intuition of mine, which may or may be right or wrong. But if you take a kid that's struggling on phonics, and sometimes I really dislike this term treatment resistors, where kids are just struggling under phonics. But these kids are often very clever kids. And if you can actually tell these kids, and this is my brother's intuition or anecdote that he would tell you if he were here. He deals with kids that are struggling with the current kinds of instruction, which is such a focus on exactly their weakness, and they can kind of bootstrap it and kind of put it as, oh my God, this system makes sense. I have no idea, all these irregular words, nothing makes sense. And now all of a sudden, you're telling me that this is the way it works, and oh my God, it makes sense. And then they're engaged and they're interested, and then you can kind of scaffold that interest and that logic and their kind of intelligence to learning grapheme phoneme correspondences, because they got to do that. There's no, I mean, it's not, but you might be able to do that better in a different context if you just focus on scope and sequence and say, well, it hasn't worked this year. Let's double the speed and let's do twice as much. That could be for some kids very disheartening and discouraging. And so my intuition is not always the case that, more systematic focus on a weakness of a child is going, yeah, it's possible that the best way to deal with the weakness is practice it more. So, that would be another intuition that would be plausible. And structured word inquiry is too damn tough. I have my criticism of structured word inquiry. And Nathan might know this. I had a paper where it's actually not that easy to. It involves to get teachers to be expert in teaching structured inquiry is not a trivial matter. I mean, and so I think I would, if I had a kid who was struggling, and I could have Peter Bowers teach structural inquiry, or anyone who's expert, I would go for it. But the study we did, we found it was difficult to get in a very short workshop with teaching assistants in complicated situations to be good enough. And so, structural inquiry is it's not a panacea that's going to easily be rolled out as an alternative. And there's a lot, like you say, there's not a lot of evidence for it, but purely in terms of the intuition, to me, it might well be a good approach. If kids struggling with one thing, help them, allow them to leverage their strengths.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point. I think there's lots of cases of students, right? And I think that there's a possibility that for some students with really severe difficulty with phonology, that the system that essentially is designed to use phonology to read words is in some way broken. There are studies from 100 years ago showing that if you have a brain lesion in a certain part of the brain, it's very hard to decode, or it's very hard to recognize real words depending on the kind of lesion. So I think it's possible there are kids who have such challenges with the phonology that something else is better, right? Frank Rameau, I think, had a paper, Rameau and Senkovitz, I think, where they talked about the fact that he thinks there's like 2% of people who have something really unique and different. And I think for those people, there's not, I think that so that's not instructional research, but I think that it's possible to argue in the same way you're thinking, Jeff, that some students who have that serious a difficulty with phonological processing might benefit from something that doesn't require as much of that, right? And focusing on morphology, I'm not sure about the way that it happens in structured word inquiry, but I think focusing on morphological units, focusing on bigger units is helpful. And the nice thing about it is that it gives you these big chunks that you can put together, so there's less phonological pieces, fewer phonological pieces, and it gets you something about meaning, right? Which is part of the point of structured word inquiry, but works in lots of different contexts. The last thing I'll say, though, is many of the children that we look at and we find have serious reading difficulty, when I talk to teachers, when I work with these students, when I help teachers, students with disabilities improve reading outcomes, often what do we see is that those students are having difficulty in part because they didn't get instruction on graphing phoneme correspondences using an explicit systematic phonics approach or something akin to that. And I think that's the piece that concerns me most. Being a teacher, having been a teacher, being in the field, is I see a lot of times that in the absence of that, what's happening is kids are getting, they have a almost complete lack of understanding of the letter sound system because they're not getting anything that's really systematic in that space. They get teachers, teaching high frequency words, spelling those high frequency words, saying them really quickly, and then very little in the form of graphing phoneme correspondence, teaching the letters, teaching maybe the sounds of the letters, but not applying that to real reading. And those kinds of things are resulting in difficulty for kids. And so when then we introduce something explicit, systematic, we get amazing effects on student achievement. But what's interesting about that is the counterfactual is kind of, to your point, not great, but the counterfactual is more kind of, I think, akin to whole language, where there's almost no emphasis on, the letter sound correspondences. So I think that's the kind of the key point for me is I agree that for certain students, the morphology piece is really important and a really good idea because of the phonological challenge. However, many of the students we're working with don't have that level of difficulty and that they can respond to other forms of instruction. Some of that I think could be morphological, but I think a lot of that could be focusing on the letter sound correspondence because often that's what they're missing, right? I often think about, grapheme phoneme correspondence, like it sort of bootstraps things, right? If kids didn't get sort of like some of the ideas from their early learning about how the letter sound system works, we can kind of like basically help them out. We can kind of push them up the ladder and say like, you never figured out that A says A. Now I'm going to tell you that A says A. And, C says, and we sort of like can kind of like, we can sort of ramp them up more quickly when they have that difficulty, because certainly lots of kids are going to learn through opportunities to read and through some, focus on morphology and so on, even if it's not focused on the letter sounds. But a lot of other kids aren't going to benefit just with that. They need support, more systematic support with the letter sound system. I think, yeah. And I think so. And I think probably the ultimate point there too is it's important for teachers to evaluate the strengths and needs of their students, to understand the kind of challenges that they have, the kind of strengths that they have. Do they understand letter sounds? Do they understand how to read words in isolation? Do they understand how to read quickly? Can they answer comprehension questions? All of those things as a package, that's what teachers need to put together to figure out what's the optimal kind of instruction. I would also say, though, giving teachers an opportunity to use a program that gets them started, that gives them some structure is also helpful for a variety of reasons. So now I'll turn it back to you. But anyway, so thank you for the opportunity to kind of just say a couple things there.
Yeah.
I just, sorry, if I think we're running low on time, Jeff. So if you could actually just make your final statements, and then I'll let Devin make any final statements he has, and then we'll just wrap up if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, first, very briefly, in response to, I want to emphasize, I know structural word inquiry is not the focus of today's thing, but structural word inquiry is not a morphological form of instruction. It teaches the interrelations between morphology and phonology and so forth. So there's lots of explicit instruction of grapheme phoneme correspondences within structured word inquiry. So just don't want to leave the impression that it's a form of morphological instruction. It's not. And the other thing I'll say is, it relates to my wrapping up message, I suppose, is that if indeed, for many kids, explicit systematic phonics is leading to fantastic outcomes, it's just strange to me that the empirical evidence is hard to find. So, I mean, if, it'd be nice, at one point the question was asking what kind of research should be done. It'd be good to have, experiment where, you had two people with different philosophies about education, taking these two kids and randomly assigning them to systematic phonics condition versus, I mean, I find it, sort of boring to try the whole language one, but that's the debate that's being had. So have, and find out, in a controlled randomized study, whether indeed this one-on-one or small group instruction, extra instruction is, the driving force behind it really was the explicit systematic phonics, as opposed to, small group extra instruction that would lead to better outcomes in any case. So, my paper that, sort of, we start off debating is, where is the evidence in the kind of standard approach for long-term benefits and often even short-term benefits on reading comprehension, reading accuracy, reading text, and it's just surprisingly weak. If I were a betting person, if I had a child and my two choices were phonics versus whole language, I would go for phonics because it makes a lot more sense theoretically. I'm more I'm more sympathetic to the idea of explicit instruction on grapheme phoneme correspondences is a good idea. I just don't think phonics is the only way to do it. And I think you could improve it by doing it maybe in a different way, teaching these grapheme phoneme correspondences. But the bottom line to my mind is that the evidence is so weak compared to the claims and I think people need to acknowledge or they should acknowledge the fact that the evidence is not so strong, and partly because I think it would make it easier for people to try to improve upon it. And it's not, in my mind, it's not just, I mean, in my structural word inquiry is not just phonics plus some extra stuff. That's fine. That might be another good approach. Trying to invent a curriculum where phonics is more effective when embedded subsequently followed by some other things. That would be fine. But that's what's been done in England effectively, and it's not with much success as far as I can tell. But it's not a high fidelity test, the PISA and the Pearls and the SAT scores. So I just think we would be well served if people were a little bit less confident that the answer is clear and more open to kind of exploring different approaches. I have my preferred approach that I would like to see more research on. And I would just like people to be described. I'm willing to say that the evidence for structured word inquiry is the empirical evidence is very preliminary. I think there's some promising findings, but I wouldn't want to make strong claims about it. I think the same should be said about phonics, and people say too strong things. So that's my message.
Thank you, Jeff. Devin.
Yeah, well, this is fun. It's an opportunity to kind of think about these things in detail because it's important. I think first, Jeff, one of the things you said I think is important is that although, you are thinking of this as an opportunity for people to push whole language, it does get used that way because your critique of phonics is so strong, right? And that, and when you say, like, I'd have my kid in a phonics program, that suggests to me that, in some fundamental way, there is a benefit to that. And I find other researchers who don't always believe in phonics do this for their own children. So I think it's just, worth thinking about the fact that this leaves open the door to criticize phonics so much that people don't use it at all. The next thing I'll say is that I think the evidence is there. I mean, the evidence for structured word inquiry is very preliminary, whereas the data on, phonics, given that it is limited in many ways, one particularly being the effects on comprehension are not as strong, another being that the longitudinal effects are not quite as strong, and the last piece being that the counterfactual, the alternative to phonics in some of these studies is not particularly strong. I think those are legitimate concerns, but I think overall the effect sizes are large. They're in some cases massive. There's a meta-analysis about L2 learning, last a couple of years ago that showed an effect, for a 0.53 on reading, so I think the evidence is there. The third thing I'll say is that I think one of the things that Jeff and I definitely agree on is the importance of providing information about graphing phoneme correspondences and doing that in an explicit way. What's interesting about that to me, Jeff, is that's phonics to a large extent, right? I'd almost kind of say, structured word inquiry, and other things like that are phonics plus or almost, or, phonics, almost adjacent. So I think that's another piece too, is that because we have a shared belief in the value of explicitness and in teaching of grapheme phonemes, we're a lot of the way there, right? It's just a question of kind of sort of around the edges almost. And I think the last thing is there's a need for more research. There's a need for more studies of alternatives to phonics like structured word inquiry. Perhaps we would want to do a study comparing phonics to whole language. I personally would not do that study. I would not want children to participate in a study or in a version of instruction that focused just on whole language. But I think the other piece that we need to do is to do a new, completely comprehensive meta-analysis that covers all of the phonics instruction, studies of instruction from the beginning, from the National Reading Panel's first study investigated all the way through the present. So we can really understand, especially using coding of effects and sort of, possible moderators, things like level of explicitness, things like inclusion of morphology and so on. So, so I think, again, Nate, this is great. Thank you for bringing us together. It was a fun opportunity to talk about things. I think we all will have hopefully the field will have learned a lot.
That was a really interesting discussion. And I want to say that I'm worried we didn't give this enough time just because of the depth. I'm not going to ask either of you to commit to coming back on together again, because that's always a challenge scheduling wise. But if either of you is interested in coming back on to discuss this further and sharing your perspective more, I'd be happy to have either of you on. I really enjoyed listening to both of you speak. And I think you both bring a really valuable perspective to this conversation. And I hope people can come to this conversation with an open mind on both sides and not come into this conversation hoping that they came to a certain conclusion from it before they even got started. So thank you again for your time, and both of you for your research. On a side note, Devin, if you ever do that meta-analysis, I'd love to volunteer as a free research assistant.
Maybe we could all do it together. Jeff, that's how they just do. So yeah.
It would. So yeah, if we could actually do something like that, I think that is the right meta-analysis, is to do something where we have the right control condition, and that would be interesting to me.
Awesome.
Well,
Great.
maybe we just propose this stuff. That's it for now, folks, and until next time.
Take care. Thanks so much.